The Hargroves had been throwing apples over Rachel Yoder's fence since 2019, and by August of 2021, the windrow along her eastern wire was 3 feet deep in places, a low ridge of blackened skin and collapsed flesh, running the full 330 feet of their shared boundary. In the heat of that summer, the smell came through the kitchen window in the morning, sharp and slightly sweet. And her younger child asked what it was, and Rachel said it was the neighbor's fruit going bad, which was true, and also not the whole truth. She had walked the fence line that August afternoon with a tin cup and a stick, and she had scooped some of the liquid seeping from the bottom of the windrow into the cup and smelled it, and then tasted a small amount from the tip of one finger. It was acidic and raw and faintly apply, with a bite that hit the back of the throat. She stood there for a moment in the heat, looking at the collapsed fruit, and then she looked through the wire at the Hargrove orchard, which had not been mowed in 2 growing seasons, and which showed, even at a distance, the reddish-brown flagging of fire blight damage in the upper canopy of the nearer rows. She did not write anything down that day. She went back inside and started supper, but she had recognized the smell. She had grown up with it in her grandmother's cellar in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where ceramic crocks stood in a row on a wooden shelf, and the air always carried that particular tang, vinous and acidic at once. That meant the mother was working. Her grandmother had kept a vinegar culture running continuously for more than 30 years, feeding it cider from their own press each fall, drawing off finished vinegar each spring. Rachel had learned to run the culture at age 16 and had brought a small quantity of the mother with her when she married Eli Yoder and moved to Jamesport, Missouri at age 22. She had kept it going through 12 Missouri winters in a stoneware crock on the second shelf of her cellar, feeding it cider from the 2 old apple trees in her own dooryard. The culture was now 11 years established in Daviess County soil and fruit. It was, in her estimation, the most reliable thing she owned. She sold raw apple cider vinegar in small quantities already, through her existing accounts at Hennessy Natural Foods in Chillicothe and at the Jamesport sale barn. She sold it in half-pint jars because that was all she could produce from 2 backyard trees. She had priced it at $7 a half pint and had never had any left over at the end of a sale barn Saturday. The Hargroves orchard had 214 trees still in leaf, as she would later count. That was what she was thinking, standing at the fence in August 2021 with the smell of wild fermentation rising from the windrow at her feet. She went inside and started supper, but she remembered the number. In July of 2022, she asked Gary Spence to drive her to Gallatin. Gary was a retired Daviess County farmer, English, in his early 60s, who had been hauling Jamesport area Amish families to town for 11 years in a maroon Ford Econolease with 190,000 miles on it. He charged 55 cents a mile plus wait time and was reliably on time and reliably quiet, which Rachel appreciated. The drive from her farm to the Daviess County seat was 17 miles on state roads, and Gary made it in 22 minutes, which was faster than Rachel would have liked because it left her less time to organize her thinking. The Daviess County Extension Office was in a 1-story building on the south side of Gallatin's Courthouse Square, behind a small parking lot. Gary waited in the van. Rachel went in with her black canvas bag and asked the woman at the front desk if she could speak with Dale Whitaker. Dale Whitaker was the county's agricultural extension agent, a lean man in his mid-40s with reading glasses on a lanyard and a measured way of speaking that Rachel had encountered once before, 3 years earlier, when she had asked him a question about fire blight management on her own dooryard trees. He had given her a precise and useful answer that time, and she had thought well of him since, which was part of why she wanted to look him in the face when she asked for the Hargrove file. He brought the file himself. It was a manila folder, not especially thick, and he set it on the small table in the meeting room and sat across from her and said that he was happy to share it, but that his assessment in it was not going to be encouraging if she was thinking about the tax sale. She said she understood that and asked if she could read it through. He said of course and went back to his desk. The file held 4 documents. There was a property description from the county assessor's office, which confirmed the parcel at 12.3 acres and gave its soil mapping unit as Grundy-Laganda Complex, 2 to 5% slopes, which Rachel had already determined herself from the web soil survey on the library computer in Jamesport. There was a 1-page site visit summary written by Whitaker himself in May of 2022, which used the phrase, "not recommended for rehabilitation," and cited fire blight pressure, the cost of tree removal, and poor commercial variety selection as the basis. There was a photograph taken from the lane of the orchard's middle rows, which showed the canopy damage accurately enough. And there was a document she had not expected. A Missouri State Fruit Experiment Station variety trial record dated 1987, a carbon copy on onion skin paper, listing the rootstock and scion variety planted at establishment for this specific orchard. The rootstock column listed M106 for 61 of 100 surveyed trees, with M7 for the remaining 39. She read the rootstock column 3 times. M106, Malling Merton 106, was a semi-dwarf rootstock developed in England in the 1950s, widely planted in Midwest commercial orchards through the 1980s and 1990s because it was productive, relatively anchorage stable, and relative to many other rootstocks of its era, moderately tolerant of fire blight in the root system and lower trunk. The fire blight that had come through the Hargrove orchard in 2017 had devastated the scion varieties, the grafted-on commercial wood, the red delicious and golden delicious that had been chosen for their fresh market appearance, and that had no particular fire blight resistance to speak of. But the rootstocks, the ML106 wood below the graft unions, were another matter. Where the scion wood had died back entirely, some of those rootstocks would have thrown suckers. The sucker growth would be the rootstock's own variety, not the grafted commercial apple. And MM1106's own fruit was small, dense, tannic, and sharply acidic, unmarketable to any fresh market buyer. Excellent for cider, better than excellent for vinegar. Whitaker had not weighed any of this because his frame was fresh market and juice production. His assessment was correct within that frame. Rachel's frame was different. She closed the folder and went back to the front desk and asked if she could have a copy of the 1987 rootstock record. The woman at the desk made a copy on the office machine. Rachel folded it into her bag. She thanked Whitaker on her way out. He told her again that the orchard was in poor shape and that she should think carefully. She said she appreciated it and meant it, because he was a careful man, and his opinion was worth having, even when she disagreed with it. Gary drove her home in 22 minutes. She sat in the second-row seat and looked out the window at the Daviess County corn, which was tasseling in July heat, and she thought about the 1987 document the whole way. She walked the Hargrove parcel on July 14, 2022, on a Tuesday morning when the dew was still on the grass. The orchard lay east of her farm, accessible from her side by a field gate in the shared fence line. She had confirmed with the county collector's office by telephone that the property was tax delinquent and scheduled for the August sale, and that she was permitted to walk it as a prospective bidder. She wore rubber boots and carried her composition notebook, a 100-foot cloth measuring tape she had bought at the hardware store in Jamesport 12 years ago, and a small penknife. She went through the gate at 7:40 in the morning. The lane middles had not been mown in 2 full seasons. The grass came to her hip in the low spots. In the first row she walked, the south row. She counted 47 trees total, 31 with live canopy, 11 standing dead, and 5 down. She wrote the numbers down as she went. The live canopy fraction in the south row was 66%, which was better than she had expected from the road. She moved methodically north, one row at a time, recording counts. The fire blight damage was not uniform. The worst of it concentrated in the northeast corner of the parcel, in a low area where cold air would pool in spring, accelerating early bloom and increasing the window of infection. In that corner, the kill rate reached 80%, and she walked through it quickly and made a note to stay out of it in any planning. The south and central rows were different. The surviving trees there were crowded with dead scaffold wood. The fire blight strikes from 2017 still visible as brown mummified branch tips, but below the strikes in many trees there was good live wood, and the canopy, though distorted, was carrying leaf and, in many cases, small developing fruit. In the third row from the south, between the 4th and 11th trees counting from the east, she found what she had been looking for without being certain she would find it. 8 trees in sequence where the original scion wood had died back entirely to the graft union and the rootstock had thrown suckers. The suckers were now 5 to 7 years old, vigorous with small waxy leaves distinct from the broader leaves of the surviving red delicious wood in the adjacent trees. The canopy on these 8 trees was dense and low, shaped by their own growth habit rather than any training. She bent down and looked at the graft unions on 2 of them. The union was visible as a slight thickening of the trunk at about 12 inches from the ground, with the sucker growth clearly originating below it. She was certain. She cut a small branch from the nearest tree with her penknife, about 14 inches long, and stripped a few leaves to look at the pith. Green throughout. She found a developing fruit on the branch, roughly the size of a large marble, hard as a stone. She bit into it. The tartness was immediate and pronounced, with a tannin bite that dried the inside of her cheek, and an acid quality that was sharp without being unpleasant, the kind of acid that meant fermentable sugars would develop over the next 2 months as the fruit ripened. It was nothing like a red delicious. It was better than a red delicious for her purposes, by a significant margin. She wrote in her notebook, row 3, trees 4 through 11 from east, rootstock fruit, tannin strong, good acid. These are better than anything Hargrove was selling. She continued north through the remaining rows. Her total count at the end of the walk, recorded in the notebook, was 214 trees showing leaf canopy. She estimated average canopy spread at 12 feet, consistent with semi-dwarf AEM 106 at approximately 25 years of growth without pruning pressure. At the northwest corner, she found the old cider house foundation, a poured concrete pad, partially obscured by honeysuckle growth, with the collapsed timber of the structure above it rotted down to the slab. She pulled the honeysuckle back from one corner and measured the pad with her tape. It was 24.5 feet by 18.2 feet, east to west and north to south. The floor drain at the center was intact and unobstructed. She measured the drain opening, 4 inches. The concrete was in sound condition, no significant cracking. The surface slightly roughened by weather but not spalled. She estimated the collapse of the structure above it at approximately 3 to 4 years ago, based on the oxidation of the exposed nailheads in the rotted wood, which had progressed to a powdery reddish surface, rust consistent with 3 to 4 years of open-air exposure in a Missouri climate. She wrote down all of this: the pad dimensions, the drain, the nail oxidation, the vine coverage. On her way back south, she walked the fence line along her own boundary. The windrow of dumped cull fruit ran the full length of the wire, lower in some places than she remembered from the previous August, which meant some of it had settled further into decomposition over the winter. In the July heat, the smell rose from the base of the windrow where the moisture collected. It was the same smell she had noted in August 2021. Acetic acid, produced by Acetobacter bacteria, converting the ethanol from wild fermentation in the decomposing fruit, working without any management or vessel, entirely in the open air on a county road edge. She wrote, "The ground itself has been making vinegar. We will just do it properly." She had been in the orchard for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She walked back through the gate, latched it, and drove the buggy home. She was pulling the harness from the horse in the barn when she heard Mervyn Schrock calling from the north fence line. Mervyn farmed the 160 acres immediately north of the Hargrove ground, corn and soybeans and a small beef herd, and he had watched the Hargrove orchard deteriorate since 2017 with the particular aggravation of a man whose neighbor's neglect creates work for him in the form of yellow jackets and windblown diseased wood crossing his fence. He was 52, deliberate, not unkind, with a habit of stating his opinion once and not repeating it. She walked to the north fence. He asked what she had been doing in there. She told him she was looking at the ground ahead of the tax sale. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that it was a waste of money, that the extension office had written it off, and that she would be better off paying someone to push those trees down, because the ground underneath was not worth farming without a full clear and at least 2 years of cover cropping to get ahead of the fire blight inoculum in the soil. He said it without heat. He said he was only telling her what any farmer who had watched that orchard for the past 5 years would tell her. She thanked him and said she would think about it. She went inside and wrote down the pad dimensions again in a clean column on a fresh page, and beneath them she wrote the tree count, and beneath that she wrote the year she had brought the mother culture to Missouri, and the current price per bottle at Hennessy Natural Foods, and the sell-through rate on her half pints at the Jamesport Sale Barn, which was 100% every Saturday she had attended in the past 2 years. She did not write down Mervyn Schrock's opinion. She had already heard it from Dale Whitaker, and from the county assessor's office, and from the visible consensus of the 2 other farmers who had walked the fence line at different points in the preceding months, and kept walking. She understood the opinion. She had a different set of numbers. The Daviess County tax sale was held on the courthouse steps in Gallatin on August 23, 2022, beginning at 10 in the morning. Gary Spence drove Rachel the 17 miles to Gallatin and parked on the square. She had registered as a bidder with the county collector's office the previous week by telephone and had confirmed the opening bid amount, $4,870, representing the full delinquent tax balance, including penalties and fees assessed through July 31, 2022. She had brought a cashier's check from Farmers and Merchants Bank in Gallatin for $6,000, which was more than she expected to need and less than she had in savings. And she had told no one except Gary, who was required to know because he was waiting in the van. There were 11 people on the courthouse steps when the collector began. Rachel knew 2 of them by sight. One was a Chillicothe real estate investor named Baxter, who attended most Daviess County sales and who wore the same canvas cap each time, as though he wanted to be recognized as a regular. The other was a row-crop farmer from the east side of the county who had the Hargrove grounds north-facing backslope in view from his road and had apparently considered whether it was worth adding to his operation. From the way he stood and looked at the parcel description sheet, Rachel judged he had already decided it was not. The collector read the parcel description: 12.3 acres, Grundy Laganda soil complex, formerly improved with orchard and accessory structure, delinquent since 2019. Opening bid $4,000. Baxter bid $4,070. The row crop farmer bid $4,950. Baxter bid $5,000. Rachel bid $5,100. The row crop farmer looked at her. He did not bid again. Baxter bid $5,100. Rachel bid $5,200. Baxter did not bid again. The collector waited. Nobody moved. He brought the gavel down. Rachel wrote the cashier's check at the collector's office window inside the courthouse. The clerk confirmed that the prior owner, the Hargrove family, held a 1-year right of redemption under Missouri law, and that if they paid the delinquent taxes plus interest, and Rachel's purchase price plus costs within 1 year of the sale, the property would revert to them. Rachel said she understood this and had budgeted for the possibility. She did not think they would redeem it because they had left Daviess County, but she had set the sum aside in a separate envelope in her household safe in case she needed to account for it. If they redeemed, she was out $5,200, plus the attorney's review she had already paid, and she would not have the orchard. But she would not be damaged beyond the loss of a year's planning. She had thought this through carefully before bidding. She walked back to the van. Gary pulled out of the square and onto the highway north. On the ride home, she opened the composition notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "Paid $5,200. Now we find out if I am right." The fall of 2022 came in dry and warm, which was good for harvest and bad for fire blight spread, because the bacterium that causes fire blight, Erwinia amylivora, favors wet and warm conditions in the bloom period, and the damage for this season was already done in any case, and the dry fall simply meant the existing strikes held where they were, rather than progressing further. Rachel wasn't thinking about the fire blight. She was thinking about fruit that was on the trees. She had hired 2 men from the settlement for the initial cleanup work, both in their 20s and familiar with orchard labor from work on a larger operation south of Jamesport. She paid them $40 a day each, 8 days of work across 2 weeks in September, which totaled $640. The work in those first 2 weeks was not harvesting. It was removal of hanging dead wood from the surviving trees, which she prioritized because dead wood in the canopy is a reservoir of fire blight inoculum, and because it was blocking light from the live scaffold branches beneath it. She did not attempt to shape the trees in year 1. She only removed what was clearly dead, using pruning saws and loppers, working from the ground and from wooden stepladders, no power equipment. The brush was dragged to the lane middles and piled for later burning. She borrowed a horse-drawn sickle bar mower from a neighbor in the settlement at no cost, and mowed the lane middles in late September, which made the ground navigable with a wagon for harvest. The harvest from 214 trees in fall 2022 was, as she had expected, light. The trees had not been pruned or managed in 5 years, and a neglected tree puts its energy into wood before fruit. She picked and gathered what the trees offered: drops, culls, sound fruit of irregular size, and in some cases visible scab or russeting, all of it unmarketable by any fresh market standard, and all of it, in her judgment, sound enough inside for pressing. From the rootstock trees in row 3, she took the small, dense fruit carefully, keeping it separate in its own bushel baskets. She pressed the 2 lots separately. The press she was using was a rack and cloth model, wooden with a cast iron screw, purchased in late September from the estate sale of an Amish farmer in Clark, Missouri, another real settlement 30 miles north. She had seen it advertised on the board at the Jamesport hardware store and sent a letter, and Gary Spence had driven her to Clark to inspect it and bring it back in the van for $340. It was functional and well made, and she set it up on her own barn floor, run by the same 5-horsepower Briggs & Stratton stationary gasoline engine, mounted on a timber skid that she used for her honey extractor, connected by a flat belt to the press's drive wheel. The engine was permitted under the ordnung of her district, which allowed stationary gasoline engines as a power source for shop and processing equipment. It was not a rubber-tired tractor. It did not move under its own power. It sat on the skid in the barn and ran the belt, and that was the extent of it. She pressed the full harvest over 3 days in early October. The general lot, pressed first, yielded 163 gallons of juice. The rootstock lot, pressed second, yielded 17 gallons of a darker, more viscous juice with a pronounced tannic quality she could smell from 2 feet away. She recorded both figures. Total pressed juice, 180 gallons. She had sourced 8 55-gallon food-grade HDPE drums from a food distributor in Chillicothe, who sold used drums cleaned and inspected at $12 each, which she had arranged through a phone call from the hardware store. Total drum cost, 96 stars. Gary had brought them up in 2 trips. She had washed and inspected each drum herself. She filled 6 drums with the general juice and 1 drum with the rootstock juice, leaving 1 drum empty as a margin. The juice went into primary fermentation immediately, pitching naturally with wild yeast, which in a cider press environment in Missouri in October needs no encouragement. She monitored the fermentation by smell and by the bubble activity at the loosely capped boom holes. Within 5 days, the smell had shifted from fresh pressed apple to something sharper and more vinous, which was correct. She ran the fermentation to completion over 6 weeks until the specific gravity measured flat with the small glass hydrometer she had owned since her grandmother gave it to her at 19. The resulting hard cider, just over 160 gallons of it after settling loss, went into the second phase, conversion to vinegar. She had kept her mother culture in its stoneware crock through the previous 11 years without break. She divided it and added portions to each drum, then removed the lids and replaced them with loose cloth covers held by rubber bands, which allowed air exchange, because acetobacter requires oxygen to convert ethanol to acetic acid. She moved the drums to the corner of the barn where the temperature held most stable through the Missouri winter, between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which was slower than a heated environment would have been, but within the working range of the culture. She wrote in the notebook, 6 drums general, 1 drum rootstock. Mother added to all 7. Will draw March at earliest. The winter was ordinary. She tended her dairy animals, bottled and sold honey from the fall extraction, and checked the vinegar drums every 10 days, lifting the cloth and smelling, watching for the opaque whitish film of the mother developing on the surface of each drum. All 7 drums showed active surface culture by mid-November. She wrote brief entries in the notebook. November 14th, film on all 7, 1/4 inch, smell correct. December 9th, film thick, surface slightly wrinkled, good sign. January 22nd, cold snap, barn to 48 degrees, film contracted but held, no loss. In February, she began hearing from the county collector's office through a letter forwarded by the attorney she had paid $175 to review the redemption terms, that the Hargrove family had made no contact regarding redemption. The 1-year clock would expire in August 2023. She noted this in the notebook. She drew the first finished vinegar on March 8, 2023. She ran a small amount through a cloth filter to check clarity, though she would bottle it unfiltered and cloudy, which is what raw apple cider vinegar should be. The mother suspended in the liquid as evidence of the process. She tasted it from a spoon over the kitchen sink. The acidity was sharp and clean. The apple character underneath was more present than in most commercial raw ACV she had tasted. More specific, with a depth she attributed partly to the Missouri fruit and partly to the age of the culture. The rootstock drum she tasted separately. The difference was pronounced. Darker, more tannic, a longer finish, more complex. She set the rootstock drum aside. She was not going to bottle that one yet. She bottled the general lot. 190 units, 32-ounce glass bottles with wide-mouth lids, labeled by hand in the first run with labels she had printed at the library in Jamesport in a simple design. Black text on cream stock, reading Yoder's Raw Apple Cider Vinegar, Jamesport, Missouri, with unfiltered with the mother in smaller text below. She called Hennessy Natural Foods in Chillicothe from the hardware store telephone. Carol Eichste, who had been buying Rachel's honey and apple butter for 4 years, answered. Rachel told her she had a new product, raw apple cider vinegar, 32-ounce bottles, and asked if Carol would take a trial order. Carol said she would take 140 bottles on consignment, sell through to be evaluated in 60 days. Rachel had Gary drive her to Chillicothe with the bottles packed in cardboard flats in the back of the van. The drive was 40 miles and cost at £0.55 per mile each way, 40 for the transit plus Gary's 2-hour wait, which he billed at $20 an hour. Total transport cost for the delivery run, $84. She kept 50 bottles for the Jamesport sale barn, where she sold them herself over 3 Saturdays in March and April at $13 per bottle. All 50 sold. She wrote the figure down, $650 from sale barn. The 140 bottles at Hennessy sold through in 38 days. Carol called the hardware store and left a message with the owner to pass to Rachel, who retrieved it the following morning. The message said, "All gone. Can you bring more?" Rachel wrote this down in the notebook too because it was data. The 140 bottles had sold at $9.50 per bottle wholesale. That was $330 from Hennessy. Combined with the $650 from the sale barn, total first revenue was $1,180. Total first-year costs were $6,073. The $5,200 purchase price, $112 in transport across 3 Gallatin trips and 1 Chillicothe run, $640 in labor, $340 for the press, $96 for the drums, $310 for bottles, labels, and lids, and $175 for the attorney's redemption review. Against $1,080 in revenue, the net position at the close of year 1 was a loss of $4,893. This was exactly what Rachel had expected. She had projected a 4 to 5 year return on the full investment based on her production estimates. And year 1 was within her range. She wrote the net figure in the notebook without comment. In April, she drove the buggy to the extension office in Gallatin. She sat across from Dale Whitaker in the same meeting room and set a 32-ounce bottle of the vinegar on the table between them. She gave him the production summary she had written out on 2 pages. Tree count, press yield, fermentation timeline, bottle count, sell-through rate. He read it carefully, which she had expected because he was a careful man. He opened the bottle and poured a small amount into the plastic cup he used for his coffee and tasted it. He set the cup down and was quiet for a moment. He told her that his assessment of the orchard had been for fresh market production and that the fermentation angle was, in his phrase, outside what I was looking at. He said it in the careful way of a man who is revising his framing without retracting his facts, which was the correct thing to do because his facts had been accurate. She said she knew that and that she had thought his report was thorough. He asked how many trees she thought were genuinely viable for continued production. She said 214 at present, and that she expected the number to decrease slightly over time in the northeast corner, as that ground continued to express the worst of the damage, but that the central and south rows were responding well to the single round of deadwood removal, and that she had not yet pruned for shape, which was the next phase of work. He said he would like to see the operation in the fall if she was willing. She said she was. She drove the buggy home 17 miles. May was coming in green and cool, the way Missouri springs come in when they are going to be good ones, and the orchard ground east of her fence showed new leaf on the surviving trees, visible even from the road, a haze of green over what had been in March a tangle of brown. She had 214 trees in a working mother culture and $1,980 in documented revenue from a first run and 2 accounts that had sold through faster than projected. She had also lost $4,893 on the year on a $5,200 investment, and the Hargrove family still held their redemption right for 4 more months. She wrote the loss figure in the notebook, closed it and set it on the shelf above her cellar stairs next to the stoneware crock, and went out to check on the dairy animals. The fence line smelled of spring, not fermentation, and the row 3 trees were leafing out like all the others, small and dense and unremarkable from any distance, giving nothing away. The summer of 2023 was wet in Daviess County, which worried Rachel in June when the rain kept coming and the humidity sat over the fields like a cloth. Because wet summers favor fire blight spread during bloom, and bloom had already passed in April. But wet summers also favor the secondary infections that move through pruning wounds and storm damage. She walked the orchard twice in June and once in early July, looking at the new growth on the surviving trees, checking for the sudden wilting and shepherd's crook bend of shoot tips that is the first visible sign of new infection. She found 3 new strikes in the northeast corner, which she had already written off in her planning, and 1 strike in the central block on a tree in row 7 that she pruned out immediately with a pruning saw wiped between cuts with a rag soaked in a 10% bleach solution. The standard field sanitation practice for fire blight management that Dale Whitaker had described to her 3 years earlier when she had asked about her dooryard trees. She wrote in the notebook, July 3, 2023, 1 new strike row 7, pruned and sanitized. Northeast corner, 3 new strikes expected. Central and south blocks clean. The Hargrove redemption period expired in August 2023 without contact. The county collector's office sent a letter confirming the deed had cleared to Rachel Yoder in full. She put the letter in the composition notebook inside the back cover, folded once. She did not make an entry about it. The fact was in the letter. What she did make an entry about was the trees in fall of 2023, because the trees in fall of 2023 were different from the trees in fall of 2022. In a way that was visible from the lane and did not require any particular expertise to see. A neglected apple tree that has had its dead wood removed spends the following growing season putting energy into the scaffold branches that remain, and the result, by late summer, is a noticeably fuller canopy and a fruit set that reflects the tree's recovered capacity rather than its depleted one. Rachel had known this would happen. She had counted on it. Seeing it was another matter. She pressed in October 2023. The yield from the same 214 canopy-bearing trees, 1 full growing season after deadwood removal, was 410 gallons of juice. She had 22 drums in operation now, the original 8 plus 14 purchased in spring 2023, at the same $12 per drum from the same Chillicothe distributor. Total additional drum cost, $160. She filled 18 drums with the general press lot and set aside 4 drums for a separate purpose. Those 4 drums she filled with a blend she had been planning since March. Roughly 2/3 general juice and 1/3 juice from the row 3 rootstock trees, pressed separately on the final day. The same dark tannic juice she had kept in its own drum through the previous winter and drawn off and tasted in stages through the spring and summer as it continued to develop. She had not bottled the rootstock drum from year 1. She had let it run longer than the general lot, held back from the first bottling run, continuing its slow surface fermentation through a second summer in the barn. By October 2023, that drum was 13 months into fermentation. The acidity was high and the flavor was layered in a way that Rachel did not have a precise technical vocabulary for, but understood by taste. She blended portions of it into the 4 new drums as a seed culture for the aged batch, alongside fresh-pressed rootstock juice. She wrote, October 11, 2023, 4 drums started, aged blend, 1/3 rootstock, mother from year 1 drum. Will not touch these until spring 2025 at earliest. She capped the 4 aged drums and wrote the date on each with a paint marker and moved them to the back of the barn. It was on the 3rd day of the October harvest, when the hired men were loading full bushel baskets onto the wagon in the central block, that Mervyn Schrock appeared at the north fence line. He had not been to the fence since the previous fall, when he had watched from a distance and said nothing. This time, he came to the wire and called over, and Rachel walked to meet him, wiping her hands on her apron. He looked at the loaded wagon. He looked at the men working in the row behind her. He said he had not thought those trees had that much left in them. She reached into the nearest basket and gave him 2 apples from the row 3 lot, which she had not yet finished sorting to their own pile. They were small, about the size of a large walnut, greenish yellow, dense, and hard. He bit into one. His expression shifted in the way of a man tasting something he did not expect. He said it was awful sour. She said yes, that was exactly right. He looked at the apple in his hand for a moment and then looked at the orchard behind her, the mown lane middles and the cleaned canopies, and the wagon with its load of fruit that by every measure he knew was not a commercial apple, and by the evidence of his own eyes was being harvested with considerable care and intention. He did not say anything else. He nodded once and walked back along his fence line toward his own equipment shed. Rachel went back to the sorting. The second press run produced 410 gallons total. After filling the 4 aged drums, she had 18 drums of general fermentation underway, the largest batch she had run. She monitored through the winter of 2023 into 2024 with the same 10-day intervals, the same cloth and rubber band covers, the same notebook entries. The barn was warmer that winter than the previous one, which ran the fermentation slightly faster, and she drew the first finished vinegar from the general drums in late February 2024, rather than March. In October of 2023, she had also made the trip to Kansas City. Gary Spence drove her the 160 miles south on a Thursday, leaving at 5 in the morning to arrive before the buyers' meeting at a natural foods cooperative that had expressed interest through a letter forwarded by Carol Eigsty, who had mentioned Rachel's vinegar to a distributor contact at a regional food trade event in September. Rachel brought 6 one-gallon jugs of the Year 1 general lot, which she had bottled in August specifically for wholesale sampling, and the 2-page production summary she had updated with the Year 2 press yield figures. The meeting was in a conference room behind the cooperative's receiving dock, with 4 people present, 2 buyers, a quality assurance manager, and a regional sales representative for a 4-state natural foods distributor named Heartland Provisions, based in Kansas City. The buyers tasted the vinegar and asked about production volume, consistency, and labeling compliance. Rachel answered each question from the notebook which she had brought. The Heartland Provisions representative, whose name was Sandra Friel, asked about Rachel's current wholesale accounts. Rachel named Hennessy, Natural Foods, and the Jamesport Sale Barn and gave the sell-through figures. Sandra Friel wrote these down. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Gary waited in the van in the loading dock. Rachel's transport cost for the day was $176, which she recorded. The result of the meeting was a provisional wholesale agreement with Heartland Provisions for 24 one-gallon jugs per month at $22 per gallon to begin with the Year 2 production in spring 2024. Rachel had Gary stop at a gas station on the way north so she could use the payphone to call the hardware store in Jamesport and leave a message for herself to remember to pull the correct labeling requirements from the Missouri Department of Agriculture website at the library. She wrote the agreement terms in the notebook on the drive home. 24 jugs per month at $22 was $520 per month, or $636 per year from the Heartland account alone. She didn't write any commentary next to this figure. The figure was its own commentary. In February of 2024, she went back to Gallatin. Gary drove her. She went to the extension office first and met with Dale Whitaker, who had visited the orchard the previous October as she had invited him to, spending an afternoon walking the rows with her and taking his own notes. He had already written, before her February visit, a 1-paragraph addendum to the Hargroves site visit file, which he gave her a copy of at this meeting. It read in part that the site's potential for fermentation stock production had not been evaluated in the original assessment, that the rootstock scion distinction in the surviving tree population represented a factor not weighed in the original recommendation, and that the documented first and second year production data provided by the current operator suggested a viable small-scale operation within the fermentation market segment. The addendum was written in the careful, passive language of an extension report. Rachel read it twice and folded it into the notebook beside the deed letter. From the extension office, she walked across the courthouse square to Farmers and Merchants Bank, where she had held a deposit account for 6 years. Tom Graber, the agricultural loan officer, was a man in his mid-50s who had watched Rachel's deposit activity across those 6 years with the mild professional attention of someone who notices consistent patterns. Her honey and apple butter deposits were modest and regular. The vinegar deposits, beginning in spring 2023, were larger and coming in from a wider set of sources. She brought the full composition notebook and the 3-page financial summary she had prepared at the kitchen table the previous weekend. Purchase price, itemized costs by year, press yields, revenue by account, and the forward projection based on the Heartland Provisions Agreement. She set these on the desk and Graber read through them without speaking for several minutes. He asked about the Heartland Agreement, and she showed him the written terms. He asked about the orchard's current assessed value, and she told him it was assessed at $9,800 by the county, which was the standard agricultural land value for 12.3 acres of Grundy-Laganda ground in Davis County, a figure that did not reflect the orchard's production history or its improvement. He said that on the basis of the documented revenue progression and the active distribution agreement, the operation would qualify for a working capital line of credit of up to $15,000 if she needed to expand fermentation capacity. She thanked him and said she would prefer to grow from cash flow for the present. He said that was a sound approach and that the offer stood. He also said, in the way of a man stating a professional conclusion rather than offering encouragement, that the operation represented a viable collateral asset. She wrote those 4 words in the notebook, right there at his desk, while he watched. She said, "I want to make sure I have that correctly." He said she did. The spring of 2024 brought a food writer from Kansas City named Lena Park, who had heard about the operation from Sandra Friel at Heartland Provisions, and who drove up to Jamesport in April with a camera and a notebook of her own, and spent 4 hours at Rachel's farm and orchard. Rachel answered her questions directly and showed her the composition notebook and the 1987 rootstock document from the extension file and the stoneware crock on the cellar shelf. She did not tell her what to write. She showed her what was true. The article appeared in a regional food magazine in May 2024 under the title Single Origin Amish Apple Cider Vinegar from a 35-year-old Missouri orchard. It ran 4 pages with photographs, the crock on the shelf, the row 3 trees, the concrete pad with the drums arranged on it, Rachel's hands holding a 1-gallon jug against the light. Rachel did not see the magazine until Carol Eichste mailed her a copy, which arrived folded in a padded envelope in late May. She read it at the kitchen table. The facts in it were accurate. She put it in the notebook's back cover beside the deed letter. The Heartland Provisions account doubled its monthly order to 48 jugs in June 2024, citing demand they had not projected. Rachel confirmed by letter that she could supply this volume from the year 2 and year 3 production combined, which was correct by her drum inventory. In October 2024, she went into the orchard on the morning of the 9th, a Wednesday, with the bushel baskets and the wagon. She went to row 3 first. The 8 trees in positions 4 through 11 from the east had been through 1 full pruning cycle since her first walk in July 2022. The dead scaffold wood above the graft unions removed in year 1. The sucker growth shaped lightly in spring 2023 to open the canopy center for light and air movement. In October 2024, they stood at roughly 8 feet of canopy height. Not tall trees, dense and rounded, the branch structure more visible through the fruit load than through the leaf, because the fruit load on these trees was heavy relative to their size. The fruit was the same as it had always been, small, greenish yellow, hard, unmarketable by any standard that anyone selling apples for eating or even for juice would recognize as commercial. She picked from the first tree, working around the canopy, dropping fruit into the basket at her feet. She moved to the second tree, then the third. By the time she reached the 8th tree, she had filled 4-bushel baskets from this cluster alone. She set the last basket on the wagon and looked back at the row. She had tasted the marble-sized fruit on these trees in July 2022 and written, "Tannin strong. Good acid. These are better than anything Hargrove was selling." In October 2024, she did not write anything about them. She loaded the baskets and moved to the next row. The 4 aged drums in the back of the barn had been running since October 2023. She checked them that evening, lifting the cloth covers, bending to smell the surface. The film on each drum was thick and slightly amber-tinted, the mature mother of a long fermentation. The smell was deep and dark, more complex than the general lot at the same stage, with a sharpness that cut through the barn air. She replaced the covers and wrote in the notebook, October 9, 2024. Aged drums holding. Will draw February 2025. In the same week, a letter arrived from Chillicothe, from Carol Asti at Hennessy Natural Foods. Carol had written it herself, on Hennessy letterhead, addressed to Sandra Friel at Heartland Provisions, with a copy forwarded to Rachel. The letter was a professional reference, unsolicited, describing the 4-year wholesale relationship, the consistent sell-through rates, the product quality and reliability, and recommending Yoder's raw apple cider vinegar for expanded regional distribution without reservation. Carol had not told Rachel she was writing it. Rachel read it standing at the mailbox and then walked back to the house and put it in the notebook. She did not make an entry about it. The letter said what needed to be said. Year 3's full revenue, across all accounts, settled at $31,400 by December 2024. That figure included the Heartland Provisions account at the doubled rate from June through December, Carol's standing bottle order, the sale barn sales, the Kansas City cooperative account she had opened in fall 2023, and a small direct sale volume from Amish and English customers who came to the farm gate after the magazine article. Operating costs in year 3, covering additional fermentation equipment at $290, upgraded professional food-safe label printing at $640 for 1,000 units, and 4 transport trips to Chillicothe and 2 to Kansas City through Gary Spence, totaling 380 seats, came to $1,016. Net year 3, $30,080. She wrote the net figure in the notebook in the same column as the year 1 loss of $4,993 and the year 2 net of $2,832. Added together with the year 1 loss and the year 2 gain, the cumulative position at the close of year 3 was a net of $28,023 across all 3 operating years, against a total invested cost of $14,377. She reviewed these columns on a Sunday evening in January 2025, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a cup of tea going cold beside it. The arithmetic was not complicated. She checked it twice, as she always did, and the figures did not change. In the spring of 2025, she received a letter from Mervyn Schrock. He had not written to her before. The letter was 3 paragraphs in his plain, careful handwriting, and its substance was a question. He had a parcel of ground on his deceased father-in-law's farm outside Chillicothe, a south-facing slope that had carried an old orchard of unknown variety and age, abandoned longer than the Hargrove ground had been, and he wanted to know what she would look for when she walked it. She wrote back with a list. What to bring: a penknife, a cloth tape, a notebook. What to look for: the graft union on any tree still standing, whether sucker growth had originated above or below it, the size and texture of any developing fruit. the presence or absence of a floor drain on any existing foundation. What to record: row counts and live tree fractions, compass orientation of the slope, any evidence of old drainage or irrigation. She told him to taste the fruit if he found any, even if it was small and hard, and nothing a person would want to eat. She told him to write down what it tasted like. He appeared at her farm gate on a morning in late May 2025. He stood at the gate without coming in, the way people do when they want to ask something but are uncertain whether the asking is an imposition. And Rachel was crossing the yard from the barn and saw him and called for him to come in. He came to the porch step. He said he had walked the Chillicothe parcel twice and had found what he thought were rootstock suckers on 6 trees in the east half of the old orchard, and that the fruit he had tasted was very small and very sour. She asked, "How sour?" He thought about it and said it dried the inside of his mouth the way green walnuts do. She said, "That sounds right." He told her he was thinking about putting heritage trees into a south-facing slope on his own ground in Jamesport. 40 trees on Emi Biome 11 rootstock, which a nursery supplier in Gallatin had recommended for his hillier ground as slightly more drought-tolerant and vigorous than AM Biome 6. He asked if she had any reason to think this was a mistake. She said she did not. He asked if she would be willing to consult when he was ready to press, which would not be for 3 years at minimum. She said she would. He went home. A week later, she heard from a mutual neighbor in the settlement that Mervyn Schrock had placed an order with the Gallatin Nursery for 40 semi-standard heritage apple trees on MM 111 rootstock for fall planting on a south slope of his ground, site prepared and limed the previous autumn. She did not make an entry about this in the notebook. It was his operation, not hers, and his notebook to keep or not keep as he chose. In August of 2025, she commissioned a property appraisal on the 12.3-acre parcel from a Daviess County appraiser named Robert Caskey, who had appraised agricultural ground in the county for 22 years. She had met him once before at a neighboring farm's estate settlement, and she called his office from the Jamesport hardware store telephone and described what she needed. Caskey walked the orchard on a Tuesday in late July, which was the same month she had first walked it 3 years earlier, a fact she noticed without remarking on. He spent 2.5 hours on the property and an additional hour in her barn looking at the drum inventory, the press setup, the production records she laid out for him on the workbench, and the composition notebook, which he paged through for 20 minutes with the careful attention of someone reading a primary document. He asked how she had arrived at the original purchase. She showed him the 1987 rootstock record from the extension file. He examined it and set it down. His written appraisal arrived by mail in the second week of August. The assessed value of the 12.3-acre parcel, considered as improved agricultural property with documented production history and active wholesale distribution infrastructure, was $31,500. She had paid $5,200 for it. She opened the composition notebook to the last written page and wrote, August 2025. Caskey appraisal, $31,500 for the ground. That is not counting what the vinegar is worth. She folded the appraisal report and put it in the notebook's back cover beside the deed letter and the extension addendum and the magazine article and Carol Eigstie's reference letter. The notebook was nearly full. She would need a new one before the fall press run. The Heartland Provisions account, running at 48 one-gallon jugs per month, generated $12,672 in its first full calendar year of operation at that rate. Added to the bottle accounts, the sale barn, and the farm gate direct sales, the cumulative revenue across 4 operating years, 2022 through the close of 2025, reached $107,400. Total invested cost across the same period, including the original purchase and all operating expenses, was $15,693. accounting for the year 4 editions of a second-use press purchased from an estate in Eagleville for $290, and a professional refrigerated proofing room built onto the barn's north end by 2 hired men from the settlement over 2 weeks in June 2025. Materials at $1,740, labor at $320. The net across 4 years, against the original purchase of a fire-damaged, tax-delinquent orchard that 2 other bidders had walked away from at $5,100, was $91,707. The parcel itself was appraised at $31,500. The business carried an active regional distribution agreement, 2 established wholesale accounts, a documented production history, and a stoneware crock on the second shelf of the cellar that had been running continuously for 15 years in Missouri, and before that for more than 30 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, without interruption. Mervyn Schrock's 40 trees went into the ground on his south slope in September 2025. He planted them himself with his sons, 2 rows of 20 on Palm 111 rootstock, spaced 14 feet apart in the row and 18 feet between rows, on ground he had limed and cover cropped the previous year. He would not see fruit for 3 growing seasons. He had a notebook. Whether he would use it correctly was his business. The fence line between Rachel's eastern boundary and the Hargrove ground, now her ground, was the same fence it had always been. The same wire, the same posts, some of them original to the Hargroves planting in 1987. The windrow of cull fruit that had built up along the wire through 5 years of the Hargroves dumping their unmarketable loads was long since worked into the soil by earthworms and weather and the ordinary action of time, and the grass along the fence grew thick there, fed by what had decomposed. The 8 trees in row 3 were leafing out in spring as they always did, a little later than the other rows, because their canopy was denser and the air moved through them more slowly in the cold mornings, and they would carry fruit again in October as they had done every October since Rachel had found them in July 2022, small and hard and sharply acidic, tasting of nothing anyone would want to eat fresh, and of exactly what she had needed them to be. The Hargrove orchard was never worthless. It was evaluated by people whose frame was the wrong one, and by that frame they were right to walk away. The frame costs nothing to change. The observation costs only time and the willingness to write down what you actually find. If you're finding these useful, there's a subscribe button below. 1 decision a week with the real numbers.